Picture a king so desperate to continue his royal line that he asked his doctors to design a machine, not for war, not for medicine, but to help him fulfill the most private duty of a husband. This was Ferdinand VII of Spain, remembered less for triumphs of state, and more for the unusual, almost unbelievable details of his personal life. It is the year 1814. Spain is weary, scarred by the long shadow of Napoleon's occupation. The once mighty empire has been humbled, its colonies in the Americas slipping away, its treasury strained, and its people exhausted. Yet in the midst of this decline, one figure stood ready to reclaim the throne: Ferdinand VII, son of Charles IV. The world around him was changing rapidly. Across Europe, monarchies wavered, revolutions stirred, and new ideas of liberty and nationhood whispered through the streets. But Ferdinand was not a man of reform nor of progress. He was instead a man bound tightly to the old order, a king who longed for absolute power even as the foundations beneath him crumbled. Those who knew him described a curious figure, short in stature, thick of body, and often pale in complexion. His health was fragile, his personality withdrawn, and yet his presence loomed heavily over Spain. He was adored at first, hailed as the desired one, the monarch who would rescue the nation from French rule. But as years passed, his rule would reveal itself as something far stranger, far more unsettling than anyone had anticipated. Imagine Ferdinand as a boy, born in the year 1784, into the grandeur of Spain's fading empire. The palaces of Madrid, where he grew up, were filled with marble staircases, gilded ceilings, and long galleries of portraits, reminders of Spain's golden age, when its kings had ruled vast territories across oceans. But for young Ferdinand, these echoes of past glory only deepened the contrast with the present. Spain in the late 18th century was not the Spain of exploration and conquest. It was a nation heavy with tradition, burdened by debt, and often overshadowed by stronger European powers. At court, life was ceremonious and rigid. Ministers whispered in corridors, courtiers moved with stiff politeness, and the young prince observed it all from behind a quiet gaze. Ferdinand's childhood was not especially happy. His parents, King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa, were not figures of affection. The Queen, in particular, was a dominant force, while Charles was often seen as passive, even weak. Whispers spread across the court about the influence of Manuel Godoy, the Queen's favorite and powerful prime minister. To Ferdinand, this dynamic created a sense of distance, a household of power struggles, where affection was rare and suspicion was constant. As he grew older, Ferdinand became a reserved young man. He was not known for brilliance, nor for charm. He carried himself with caution, even hesitation, but he also harbored a simmering ambition. He understood that the crown would one day be his, and already, factions within Spain looked to him as an alternative to the disliked ministers of his father's court. Then came the great upheaval of his early life, Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Spain. In 1808, French troops entered the country under the guise of alliance, but soon the truth was revealed. Napoleon intended to place his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, upon the Spanish throne. Spain erupted into resistance, the people rising in fury, their countryside scarred by war. Ferdinand, caught in this storm, found himself a prisoner. He was taken to France, to the cold and imposing chateau of Valençay, where he would spend years in confinement. Imagine the young king-in-waiting pacing through grand but silent rooms, his future uncertain, his kingdom in rebellion. Outside the castle, Europe trembled under Napoleon's campaigns, but within, Ferdinand's life was one of waiting, of frustrated hope. In Spain, meanwhile, the people did not forget him. They began to call him El Deseo, the desired one. To them, he symbolized resistance, the rightful king who would return and restore their nation. This longing grew stronger as the war dragged on, villages burned, and families mourned. Finally, with Napoleon's fall in 1814, Ferdinand was released and welcomed back to Spain. His return was triumphant. Crowds lined the streets, bells rang out, and voices cried with joy. Imagine the sight: the king, pale from captivity, riding into Madrid as his people cheered, waving flags and throwing flowers in the air. For a brief moment, Hope filled the weary land. They believed their king would reward their loyalty, bring peace, and rebuild what had been broken. Yet beneath this celebration, Ferdinand carried with him the traits that would soon shape his reign: suspicion, stubbornness, and a curious mixture of weakness and cruelty. The boy who had grown up in a cold court, the man who had endured years of captivity, had returned not as a reformer or a liberator, but as a monarch intent on absolute rule. And so, the stage was set. Spain, exhausted from war, stood ready to follow him. Ferdinand, hailed as the desired one, now sat upon the throne. What his people could not yet see, though, was how swiftly admiration would turn to disappointment, and how the private oddities of their king would soon spill into public life. When Ferdinand first settled onto his throne, the people expected renewal. They imagined reforms, justice, perhaps even a gentler age after the storms of war. But the reality that unfolded was far different. From the very beginning, Ferdinand showed himself to be a monarch of extremes. Though greeted as a savior, he quickly dismantled the liberal constitution that had been drafted during his absence. The people had dreamed of freedoms, freedom of the press, of assembly, of new rights long denied. Instead, Ferdinand restored absolute monarchy. He brought back censorship, silenced dissent, and reinstated the old privileges of church and crown. Imagine the disappointment of those who had fought against Napoleon, the veterans who had bled for Spain, now returning home only to find their king closing doors that had just begun to open. In taverns and marketplaces, whispers turned bitter. They had called him the desired one, but soon many began to call him the tyrant king. Ferdinand himself remained curiously distant. He was not a charismatic ruler. He rarely inspired loyalty through speeches or presence. Instead, he relied on spies, on censorship, on the quiet machinery of repression. Ministers rose and fell according to his suspicions. Newspapers were muzzled, gatherings dissolved, conspirators exiled or imprisoned. The streets of Madrid carried an uneasy quiet, outward calm, but beneath it, currents of frustration. At the same time, Ferdinand's private life began to leak into public rumor. For a man who desired absolute control, he was strangely lacking in personal discipline. His health was fragile. He suffered from obesity, from fits of illness that left him bedridden for days. Courtiers noted his appetite for rich food, his difficulty walking long distances, the way he seemed constantly fatigued. But more than his health, it was his obsession with succession that unsettled many. Ferdinand had no surviving children in his early marriages, and the pressure to produce an heir weighed heavily on him. His desperation grew, and with it, the peculiar measures he would take. Doctors, courtiers, and even foreign observers began to whisper about his anxieties, whispers that, in time, would give rise to the strangest rumors of all. Meanwhile, Spain itself was unraveling. Across the Atlantic, colonies that had once sent silver, sugar, and gold to Madrid were breaking away. Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, one after another, they declared independence, slipping from the Spanish crown. Ferdinand clung fiercely to the old order, but reality was slipping through his fingers. The empire that had once made Spain the envy of Europe was dissolving, leaving behind only fragments. Imagine the atmosphere in Madrid during these years. Carriages rattled down narrow streets, but the conversations inside them were tense. In salons, nobles debated loyalty and reform. In the countryside, peasants felt the sting of higher taxes, even as their sons were drawn into the army. Soldiers returned from distant campaigns weary, unpaid, and disillusioned. And in the midst of all this, the king grew more peculiar, more isolated. Behind the thick curtains of his palace, Ferdinand lived a life increasingly detached from his people. He collected curiosities, indulged strange habits, and relied more and more on doctors for ailments that never seemed to end. There were evenings when music drifted faintly through the royal apartments, the strum of guitars or the sound of quiet conversation. Yet even these moments were tinged with unease, for Ferdinand's court was never free of rumor. Ministers came and went. His wives endured both the burden of the throne and the personal oddities of their husband. The people did not yet know the full truth. They could not yet imagine the extent of their king's desperation, nor the bizarre inventions and humiliations that would define his later reign. But they sensed something was amiss. A monarch once adored was now feared, and beneath the gilded ceilings of Madrid, the seeds of scandal were quietly taking root. And so the story moves toward its strangest turn, the moment when Ferdinand's private struggles, once whispered in corridors, became an open secret in Europe. A moment when doctors, courtiers, and even foreign ambassadors would find themselves confronted with a king whose legacy would be remembered not for glory, but for the bizarre lengths he would go to preserve his line. The years passed, and Ferdinand grew older, heavier, and more desperate. The crown upon his head felt secure, but the future of his dynasty was not. He had married multiple times, yet each union failed to give him the one thing he longed for most: a living son. In royal courts, succession was not just a personal matter. It was the very foundation of stability. Without an heir, Spain risked crisis, rival claims, and even civil war. And so, the private anxieties of Ferdinand became a matter of public consequence. Courtiers whispered, physicians were summoned, and the king's most intimate struggles began to spill into political life. What was whispered in those corridors was unusual, even for the secretive world of monarchy. Ferdinand, it was said, was unable to perform his most basic marital duty. His body was weak, his health poor, and nature, as the doctors of the time explained, had not favored him in ways that allowed him to continue his line. Faced with this problem, Ferdinand turned not only to physicians but to invention. A contrivance was devised, a peculiar mechanical device, designed to help the king in his most private moments with his queen. It was an object both clinical and humiliating, a fusion of medicine and desperation. The court physicians described it in their records with measured words, but the truth was undeniable. The King of Spain required machinery to fulfill what nature had denied him. Imagine, if you will, the atmosphere of the palace during these years. Heavy curtains drawn, the scent of incense lingering in gilded halls, and behind closed doors, the uneasy murmur of doctors conferring. The queen, young and dutiful, bore the weight of expectation, while Ferdinand grew increasingly fragile, his body betraying him even as he demanded obedience from his realm. Word of these peculiar measures began to seep beyond the palace. Diplomats from foreign courts recorded the rumors in their letters. Ambassadors carried tales back to Paris, to London, to Vienna. Spain's monarch, once hailed as the desired one, was now mocked in whispers as something pitiable, a man whose authority in public was absolute, but whose struggles in private reduced him to reliance on contraptions of steel and leather. The scandal, though never shouted openly, became an open secret across Europe. It clung to Ferdinand's reputation long after, cementing his legacy not as a glorious king, but as a figure of weakness, excess, and humiliating peculiarity. And yet, despite these desperate measures, his quest for an heir remained uncertain. His earlier wives had died without children, leaving him restless and fearful. Only in his later marriage, to Maria Cristina of Naples, did hope flicker again. In the final years of his reign, she would give birth to daughters, one of whom, Isabella, would one day inherit his throne. But even this outcome would plunge Spain into turmoil, for the absence of a male heir ignited fierce disputes that rippled across the nation. Ferdinand's obsession, his humiliating contraptions, his fragility, all of it had shaped not only his private life, but the destiny of Spain itself. His most personal weakness became a matter of dynastic crisis, and his strange contrivances passed from whispers into the annals of history as one of the most bizarre legacies ever left by a European monarch. Ferdinand's health continued to decline as the 1830s unfolded. His body, already heavy and frail, grew weaker with each passing season. He suffered from gout, from swelling in his limbs, and from long periods of illness that left him confined to bed. Ministers tiptoed around his chambers, waiting for commands delivered in a faint voice, while courtiers debated in hushed tones what would happen when the king was gone. In 1833, the inevitable came. Ferdinand VII died in Madrid, leaving behind not a son, but two infant daughters, the eldest named Isabella. With his passing, the long question of succession burst into crisis. The law, as some interpreted it, favored his brother, Don Carlos. But Ferdinand, urged on by his wife Maria Cristina, had issued decrees to ensure that his daughter would inherit. And so, the moment the king's body was laid to rest, Spain found itself divided. Supporters of Don Carlos gathered under the banner of tradition, insisting that only a male heir could rule. Supporters of Isabella rallied behind Maria Cristina, who now served as regent for her child. These divisions would soon erupt into civil war, the Carlist Wars, conflicts that scarred Spain for decades to come. In this way, Ferdinand's private struggles spilled into public disaster. His inability to secure a strong line of succession, his desperate reliance on devices and physicians, and his final choice to pass the crown to a daughter rather than a brother all left deep cracks in the fragile structure of Spain's monarchy. Outside Spain, his death was noted with faint indifference. In London, Paris, and Vienna, diplomats recorded it as the passing of a monarch more peculiar than powerful. He was remembered as the king who had been adored, then despised, a ruler whose reign had coincided with the loss of an empire abroad, repression at home, and the curious scandal of a personal life forever whispered about in European courts. In Madrid, ordinary people carried on. The baker lit his oven at dawn. The sound of church bells continued to mark the hours. Carriages rolled over the cobblestones just as they always had. Yet beneath this rhythm of daily life, a new uncertainty now pressed down upon the kingdom. Spain was entering a fresh chapter, one that would be haunted by the legacy of a monarch whose reign was both tragic and strangely absurd. And so the story of Ferdinand VII drifts to its close. A king once hailed as the desired one, who returned to Spain amid cheers and celebration, but who left behind a legacy marked by repression, by personal weakness, and by the strange devices that whispered of his desperation. In the quiet of history, his reign feels less like a tale of triumph, and more like a fading echo, a reminder of how fragile power can be, and how even kings are bound by the limitations of their bodies and the burdens of their time. As you reflect on Ferdinand's life, let your thoughts soften. Imagine the streets of Madrid returning to silence after his funeral, the bells tolling gently in the evening air, the people carrying on with their lives beneath a sky unchanged by the passing of a king. History often lingers not in the grandeur of palaces, but in the simple rhythm of daily life, in the bread baked, the bells rung, the children's laughter echoing through plazas. Kings may rise and fall, but life, steady and unhurried, continues. And as you rest now, carried on the calm flow of the past, you might allow yourself to drift into sleep, knowing that even the strangest reigns eventually give way to quiet. Thank you for sharing this journey through history. When you wake again, more stories await, gentle voices from the past, ready to carry you once more into another time.